Right, that's me. Okay, well, first of all, good afternoon to you all. And also, may I thank the organisers for taking the trouble to invite me to this interesting meeting. What they've asked me to do is to talk about some of the generalities of setting occupation exposure limits, with a particular emphasis on what's going on in the European Union, which is becoming of less concern to me than it would have done a little while ago. Having said that, I'll press on and do that. So I've got a couple of things I'd like to do in my session. By the way, I get a segue straight from my introduction into what I'm doing, so don't worry, there's no break. I just move from one to the other seamlessly. First of all, I'd like to give a very simple general overview of occupation exposure limit setting. I spend quite a bit of time doing it. I've done it for a long time. I enjoy doing it. It's a difficult, pragmatic and scientific process, and there's this kind of borderland between the two, because you can't end up walking away. You have to end up doing something. You can't just say, generally speaking, I can't do it. Then I'm going to talk about the European Union and the scientific and beyond occupation exposure limits goal, which some of you probably don't know quite so much about as others. So I'll just try and explain what is going on there at the moment, where we've come from, where we're going, and then make some very general observations about some of the problems, I think that's the right word, of setting occupation exposure limits for particulates, PSBs, GBSs, whatever you like, but things that get into your lungs that aren't particularly toxic in the general sense of the word. Okay? Right, so the general definition, we need to start somewhere. Occupation exposure limits have been around for quite a long time. They're not just been developed in the 1940s. They go back at least 100 years, and I have to give credit to the Germans for this. There's some dispute, but I'm not going to, it's not worth fighting over. I think the earliest ones came from Germany, where their chemical industry developed roughly at the same time as the British chemical industry, and we developed limits at the same time. Better, but maybe a little later. The overall objectives of occupation exposure limits is to set limits for exposure via the airborne route, such that exposure, even when repeated on a regular basis over a working lifetime, will not lead to adverse effects, however you define those, on the health of exposed persons and their progeny at any time, as far as can be predicted from the contemporary state of knowledge, which means contemporary is moving all the time. Therefore, as you get more information, you feed that into the system, but also people's expectations about what is safe or protective changes. So you have several moving factors going on at the same time. Most OEL committees use a very, very similar paradigm, whether it's the MAC in Germany, the DECOS in the Netherlands, ACJH in the US, or the old watch committee in the UK that's been disbanded, not because of the EU, just because of money saving. God, is this being recorded? I need to go home at some point, so I may need to edit. I know how to edit. Okay. Now, generally speaking, we have two kinds of limits that we talk about these days. We talk about health-based limits. Now, these are essentially established where the available scientific database leads to the conclusion that you can actually identify a clear threshold, or reasonably clear threshold, some kind of dose exposure level below which exposure is not expected to lead to adverse health conditions. The important thing about health-based exposure limits is they don't take into account practicability of achieving it or cost. There's no socio-economic arguments used these days. Some of us might remember there were problems with the old TLV system in the States in the 70s, where there were sort of political arguments about whether there was influence in setting those, taking cost into account as well as health effects. But everybody seems to sort of iron that out these days, so most of us know what a health-based limit is. Secondly, we've got risk-based occupation exposure limits, where it's on the basis of the available evidence. It's not possible to define a threshold of exposure, and it's normally reversed for things like genotoxicants in some kind of way, or carcinogens, or respiratory sensitizers that cause occupational asthma, where, because we don't know where the threshold is, it must be assumed as the paradigm is that any level of exposure may carry a risk. Therefore, to some extent, you're going to have to set a limit based on judgment, or more commonly horse trading, maybe between the social partners, maybe not. Okay? However, there might be situations where you could set a health-based limit, but because of costs or practicability, the social partners, the stakeholders, might argue above where you want to be, simply to be there. So there might be a small amount of risk. You could set a health-based one, but you don't. It doesn't matter as long as you let people know what you're doing and they can make that judgment about what you've done. The general procedure, I think you've heard the terms a little earlier about what we try to do for setting occupational exposure limits, is we don't have to do every bit of toxicology on an industrial substance. You use the information that's relevant to setting an occupational exposure limit. Everybody starts out by saying, and I think it's right, that good quality human exposure data is preferred because that's the species you're dealing with. You don't have to, if you like, extrapolate. You've got people, but as we know, getting good human data is not always easy, whether it's case reports or epidemiology or volunteer studies. Then, of course, good quality animal studies are often used, and we know about that. We've had some discussion about what does good mean in an animal investigation. And don't forget, animals aren't people, that you're using them as a surrogate, and you have to, when you interpret or extrapolate from animals to people, as we know, we've got to take many factors into account. Then, of course, we use experimental and physicochemical data, and, of course, we take into account the adequacy of the quality of the overall exposure data, trying to work out what the hazards are in the first place. Then we talk about hazard characterization. We try to identify what are the key lead effects that concern us resulting from exposure. And then we've got to decide which of those is the most important one or ones that we're going to base the limit on. Now, don't forget, many chemicals can cause a constellation of effects in the short term, medium term, long term. And obviously, when you start out with a lead effect, the most critical one, you take into account the other effects, that you're protecting people against those as well. So although people talk about the one effect, you might be talking about a constellation of other effects that could possibly occur. You look at the relevant studies and look at the quality of those. And we all know about OECD guidelines and GLP these days. But for industrial chemicals, unlike, if you like, the pharma chemicals or the agrochemicals, we rely very much on sometimes older studies of variable quality. Some can be excellent, some could be less than excellent, but they might not necessarily conform to what are called OECD guidelines now, but we still use them. First of all, we like to identify those studies, then look at the mechanism of toxicity. It's become more and more important, as we've heard today. We need to understand what the mode of action used to be called a mechanism when I was young. What is going on, particularly if we want to translate or go from an animal study to humans to make sure, as we've heard today, that what goes on in beasties goes on in humans. Otherwise, it's sophistry. That's from the Greek, it's based on a false axiom, so you have to make sure you're not being sophisticated. Okay, where you can identify a threshold, you look at the dose response for each of the key effects. Usually it's one you end up with, the most serious one, or the one occurring at the lowest exposure condition. And then you establish where you think these old-fashioned terms, no effect level are, or the lowest effect level are, if you can't get the no effect level. And even in occupational toxicology these days, we've started to use benchmark doses. In other words, you look at the slope and put it into a black box and come out with other kinds of figures, which nobody quite understands completely. But it does make better use of the whole data set rather than just an arbitrary point. And don't forget, a no effect level is an artifact of the study design. It's not a real point at which no effect occurs. So, there's a lot to be said for using BMDs. even if I don't understand it. Then, of course, we apply what are called uncertainty factors. You go from that point down and reduce it. Now, these uncertainty factors in occupational exposure setting committees are generally based upon taking all the data into account and using an uncertainty factor, taking into account the quality of the day's debate, the reliability, the type of effect, the severity of the effect, a whole range of factors, which you then try to explain the best you can and use that to reduce that to what you think is a protective level for the population. As I said, most are based on the assumption people might be exposed to that substance repeatedly over working lifetime, 40 years, 40 hours a week, and so forth. And we're all familiar with those. And of course, in the breathing zone, not environmental standards. Short-term exposure limits are not particularly relevant to us, I don't think, when we're talking about PSBs, but we need to take into account effects which might occur of a short period of time, acute effects, if you like. So we do that as well. I won't say any more about those now, I don't think. Biological monitoring is an important part of occupation exposure limit setting in the broadest sense of the word. There are many materials, thank heavens we're not dealing with it today, that actually can go through the skin quite readily. Therefore, using some form of biological monitoring, normally urine or blood, to measure that chemical or a metabolite of that chemical and relate that back to an effect or to some kind of guidance figure can be incredibly helpful in people in the workplace assessing whether people are being unnecessarily exposed to a substance and help our risk assessors. So on most committees these days, you're asked to consider, is it helpful, as well as having an air standard, to set some kind of biological monitoring value? And I'm going to be talking a little bit about skulls, and the two types we've come up with and we use, other people use similar things, are a biological limit value, and that's got a number of definitions, not just skull, but other people in the US and other member states use them, represent levels of chemicals likely to present in a biological matrix. Normal things we use are urine and blood, but you can use exhaled breath. Long term, you can inhale, nail. There's lots of things you can do. I wouldn't recommend liver biopsies because it can be done, but that's not very welcome in most workplaces. Anyway, and then you can relate these to something. They might relate to the air standard, they might relate to a health effect, but they're not sharp dividing lines. But they certainly help people make assessments, particularly where the skin uptake might be more important. If you think about some of the pesticides people are exposed to, some of the things go through, they are designed to go through insect cuticles, so human skin presents very little barrier, so that they can be quite effective. Where we can't set biological limit values, we sometimes give something as a guidance value, where the concentration or the metabolite might just be a helpful guidance figure in a workplace. So it might, say, relate to a certain percentile of unexposed population. So if it's above that, it gives you cause to go back and see how are people being exposed. Do they need some kind of skin protection or whatever? It helps you make an assessment of a workplace situation. Carcinogen mutagens have always been a problem for standard setters. There is a growing recognition that carcinogenic risk extrapolation to low doses, and for standard setting for that matter, has got to consider the mode of action of a given chemical. At one time, it was quite easy. All carcinogens should be treated as carcinogens, and you dealt with them in a certain kind of way. Now we understand a little bit more about modes of action for carcinogens, and I think we've heard this morning about secondary mechanisms and genotoxicity. Don't forget, you can be genotoxic and non-mutagenic. So not all genotoxic chemicals are directly DNA reactive. We've heard about particles which most people seem to think operate by a secondary mechanism rather than a primary mechanism, for which case you can consider a threshold effect. Anyway, so there's a general agreement to distinguish between genotoxic and non-genotoxic in the broadest sense. But, as I said before, we're getting better and better at understanding some of these mechanisms and modes of action, and therefore we're able to be more precise in the way we go around recommending standards. Which means, therefore, really, the last bullet point is, you can use a threshold approach to some carcinogens, even so-called genotoxic ones. And I'll mention the ways scholars developed an approach for doing this. Okay, that's my introduction out the way. How did I do? 10 minutes? It was good? Okay. I need permission to carry on, really. Okay, I'll carry on. Okay. The Scientific Committee on Occupational Exposure Limits, as it's called now, we report to DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. You know, sometimes I just called it DN. I didn't realise the full name. It was EMP to me. But anyway, it's based in Luxembourg. It started out in 1995. When it was set up at that time, it was simply a scientific expert group, SEG. And we did the same kind of things, really, in recommending limits. Sorry, we don't set limits, we recommend limits. Recommending is all we do. And in 1999, we actually developed our methodology. We thought we ought to codify the way we operated to be as transparent as possible. And as we developed and went along, we sort of updated the methodology with new little bits, new definitions, so people could see what we were doing. But also, I think we were evolving our own process as we went along. We are very much the principles that most TLV, HAGH, MAC Commission committees work, I think. There's not much difference in the way we operate. A few nuances, which are because of the law. So 2013, the last one we did was Revision 7, and we sort of stopped at that point because in 2015, there's been a new process for SCOL. We have a new committee, a mixture of old and new, but a sort of a newish process. And the mandate, the period for which members can serve, it started at 2015 and goes on to 2018. It's 1 year less than a president. Is that right? It might be safer. Okay, the mission is fairly straightforward. We do two things. We provide the European Commission with opinions on anything they wish to know about. In other words, if they want to know about some kind of toxicological issue, they offer what's now called a mandate on a potential health effect of an occupational chemical, and we will give an opinion. But more generally speaking, most of our time is spent making recommendations for occupation exposure limits for workers, workplace protection. Now, there's a legal basis for this, and that needs to be spelled out. Most of the people around the committee on SCOL are simply scientists, not simple. Well, they might be simple, but they're occupational physicians, they're toxicologists, they're epidemiologists, occupational hygienists, and they're professionals. Academics, sometimes work in industry, sometimes doing consultancy, lots of different things, but most of them aren't really heavily involved in the regulatory apparatus. We don't classify chemicals, we don't get involved with issues of classification, although we're aware of them. We just make recommendations. But we are aware of the kind of two bits of legal basis that drive us. First of all, there's the Chemical Agents Directive, which has been going a long time, and most of the occupational exposure limits are set by us under that. That's where they end up. But there's the Carcinogens and Mutagens Directive, the CMD, which has been going along, and that also requires us to make recommendations for limits if we're asked. And I'll explain the difference between the two. In the last few years, there's been a push, if that's the right word, for us to look at more and more of the carcinogens. The stakeholders, the social partners, there's a backlog of chemicals, carcinogens, mutagens out there that haven't been sort of properly dealt with for OEL setting, and we're wading our way through those, working our way through them. Wading is too strong a term. Okay, the structure of Skoll. We have sort of a loose board. We have sort of a chair and 2 vice chairs. We have 21 members. And then we have a number of external invited experts to assist in the process. The way it's set up at the moment, we have a number of things called horizontal working groups, and they run along kind of procedural things, like one group looking at methodology and how that can be developed, cooperation, how do we speak with and interact with other international bodies setting limits, but also parts of the Commission, such as ECHA and REACH. Then there's a group called Quality that look at the documents themselves to make sure that they're written properly and correctly and transparently. And then, of course, there's a group of the hygiene and the chemical people that look at the exposure and toxicokinetics, and they're particularly valuable when it comes to making recommendations or helping us. Looking at biological monitoring, we've got 2 or 3 real experts that most of their, so if you like, their day job is doing biomonitoring and developing new techniques and applying it. So we have all we need in terms of skills in the group. The vertical working groups are the ones that work on a particular substance. And these days, they're not just called chemicals. There's a mandate. It's called a mandate. We have a secretariat, which is fairly small compared to ECHA. I think is it one, 2 people is the secretariat. And everything you want to know about this, you can look up on the website. There's a Circa BC website, but there's a public as well as a private bit. I don't know how to work it very well, so I have to get help to find where things are. But it's like all these websites, there are problems. Now, the procedure is fairly straightforward. We don't set the priority. We can make suggestions, but normally the suggestions come from the Commission, and that's probably via the social partners. They establish a list of priority chemicals. Each one then has a mandate, which comes to us. We seek volunteers with particular skills amongst the group that lead on that. So then we start working on them. We undertake a scientific evaluation. Can you read that sort? Is that okay? Yeah, sort of okay? Anyway, that's good enough, okay. So we evaluate the chemical as you'd expect. We prepare a draft recommendation, a REC, which is an opinion. And at that particular point, we then send it out for public consultation. We're open, and therefore all our documents, when we've done a draft, go out for publication to the contact points amongst the industry, the trade unions, government points, and anyone can send in comments on our draft. The period of commentary time used to be about 6 months, and generally speaking, it seems a reasonable time. It stays out there. When the comments come back, we will address them at that particular point. We modify the document according to what is sent in to us, and being open, we actually reply. We tell people how we've dealt with the comments. The comments are normally not to do with cost, or we can't do that, or practicability. It's really, have we missed out important studies? Have we interpreted correctly? And have we obeyed our own rules? In other words, our own methodology. That's fine. We can address any of those things. It goes back to DG Employment. Then DG Employment consults the, if you like, our bosses, the Advisory Committee on Safety and Health, which is the tripartite bit, via the Working Party on Chemicals. And when they're all happy, they adopt what we've said as an opinion or a recommendation, and it then goes to, in the last bit, to other directorates, DG Grow, DG Environment, DG whatever, that might have a say, and they're allowed to comment. There might be things other people have missed, and that'll sort of go through the whole process. So it's a bit of a process. The criteria for selecting substances, it can depend. I mean, there ought to be reasons, and as I said before, at the moment we're dealing with quite a few carcinogens. Epidemiological evidence, including reported cases, is always good to have. Availability of tox data, severity effects, and as I said before, that's the more serious one should be dealt with first. Numbers of persons exposed can be a great driver. Obviously, you need exposure on data if you've got it out there. And also, is there a method for measuring the material? If you set an occupational exposure limit, can somebody actually measure it? So We want to make sure that when we make a recommendation, that someone can actually measure it. The hygienist can go out there and do something. Either it's a short-term measurement or an 8-hour TWA. Someone can, there's a method for doing it. And it's not always easy. Okay. I think we've dealt with that pretty well. It goes to the committee. Our methodology, as I said before, is written down and it's been developing as we go along. As I said, our last document was done in June 2013. Our principle is that ideally we use all available data in the literature, and that's relevant to OEL derivation. We don't have to look at 700 papers or 1,000 papers, which can be available for some chemicals, if they're not relevant to setting good occupation exposure limits, recommending them. So we choose carefully what data do we need. We use the most recent, the most reliable, and the most relevant. We don't do what the DNIL people have to do, using specific factors for each of the various developmental phases of setting a DNIL. We tend to use an overall chemical-specific assessment factor that's fairly consistent. We try to follow what we've, in our own guidelines, based upon sort of broadly predefined. We have a sort of 2, 3, whatever it is. So we try to be consistent and spell out why we select an uncertainty factors. In the past, we were criticized for lack of transparency, but we're getting better at doing it and trying to spell out why we've chosen an uncertainty factor so people can understand why we've done. We don't vote. That's silly. It's a scientific committee. We use the powers of persuasion, arguments, and bullying if that fails. But we end up with a consensus, whatever that might mean. So the whole committee is responsible for what is written in the recommendation and opinion. Studies considered, obviously human data. Case reports often are important because they start off a concern. Case reports themselves aren't necessarily useful in deriving, but they actually lead on to proper studies, such as volunteer studies or epidemiological cross-section studies, cohort case control, that we know about. And you'll hear more about those tomorrow in the case of titanium, and some carbon black studies as well. Experimental data will look at everything that's relevant there. Obviously, animal investigations can be quite important. Repeat dose studies, single dose studies, whatever there happens to be there. In particular, these days, there are, for some of the more important studies, you can find there are 2-year carcinogenicity bioassays in 1 or 2 species. And then, of course, but any other toxicity studies we like. We like very much these days to get stuck into the in vitro mechanistic mode of action studies to help us explain what we see in animals. If we're using animals, is it really and truly relevant for humans? And if so, how can we use it? As I said before, standard, we want to look at thresholds of effect where we can find them, no effect levels, low effect levels if you haven't got a no effect level, other kind of benchmark doses, the whole range of things you'd expect. Kinetics of absorption, distribution, metabolism. In each recommendation is like a mini criteria document. We don't want to write 100-page documents for a recommendation, but we want sufficient science in them, rather like a MAC documentation or a TLV. Well, TLV ones, I think, are too short. The ACGH ones are very short. But the larger ones, like MAC and document, they're fairly full documents, which give you not just a recommendation, but a scientific rationale and a description of the key studies. So they're kind of standalone documents, and we try to do that as other good committees do as well. These days, as I said, we're incorporating more mode of actions and adverse outcome pathways, particularly where we're going from animals to humans, just to justify why we've done something or not done something, if we think the mode of action is not relevant for humans. And as I said, we can hear about that for particles a little later on. The limits that we set, occupational ones, the occupation exposure limit values, IOELVs, these are the ones that have to go into member states. Once they're adopted, they have to be adopted by member states. They can justify deviating from them if they wish to, as long as they can produce a justification. We also set binding occupation limit values. These are for more seriously problematical chemicals, such as carcinogens. Member states must establish that value, but they can deviate, but to a lower value. Then we set also recommend biological limit values, BLVs, GLVs, as I mentioned. Like other committees, we set skin notation. If we think risk assessors need to know that that substance can go to the skin, that might contribute to the body burden. So when our occupational hygienist or safety advisor is making an assessment, they can take into account skin contact as well as possible airborne. And of course, sensitizers, we need to alert people to those because it's very difficult to set limits for those. Okay? Legislative procedure is different for the two, health-based and binding. Can you sort of see that? If you, on one side, is it left or right? On the IOELVs, the proposed OEL is based on, yes, where do I go? Scientific considerations only, technical progress, we make a recommendation, incorporated into a directive, it's adopted, and member states have to adopt that limit within, I don't know, it's 18 months or 2 years, whatever it is. But for the biological occupation exposure limits, similar process, Council of Europe decides what they are, we make a recommendation, it goes in the same system and has to be adopted in the same kind of way. So not that different. The role of SCOL is fairly straightforward. We do the same either way. Somebody tells us what to do. We're there to serve the Commission and the committees above us. We're told what to do. We're given a mandate. They give us a list. We look at the chemical, each substance, prepare a draft recommendation, submit it back to employment. Employment then consults for 6 months with the social partners, member states. We modify as necessary. It goes back into the system again, and as I said before, around the Commission somewhere, pops out, and it has to be accepted. Carcinogens, I said I'd mention a little bit about those in the time I've got. We actually borrowed, if you like, again back to the German MAC. They developed some years ago an interesting way of dealing with carcinogens where they did a kind of mixture of hazard and risk assessment, trying to use mode of action as well as just saying it is or it isn't, which actually I thought was a useful thing to do. It was a good way to use science. First of all, and we sort of slotted our carcinogen. There's an evaluation, by the way, not a classification. Non-linear model. If it's a non-threshold genotoxic carcinogen, extrapolation test results from animals, high doses to humans, low doses, can be used. If we have the epidemiology on humans, we did this for benzene, we'd use that as well, with butadiene, vinyl chloride. Genotoxic, not sufficient to apply linear non-threshold model, acrylonitrile, benzene, naphthalene. Then, of course, group C, weak, only very weak genotoxins, very, very weak, not a major driver. A practical threshold can be based if you have the data, if you have good enough data. And I mentioned formaldehyde there, and a few other materials. And then, of course, group D, non-genotoxic, non-DNA reactive. Threshold can be based on an OAL, carbon tet for that, you know. Okay, that's the basic kind of paradigm that we use. And you can see the various pathways you can go down to A, B, C, or D, looking at the quality of the data we've got. And there's an example of the vinyl chloride. DNA reactive, it zaps down to there. Whereas on the other hand, formaldehyde, if you look at the toxicology, we decided very, very weakly genotoxic. Secondary mechanism is probably far more important, practical threshold, and where we could therefore make a recommendation. So in other words, it gives us some flexibility, a little pragmatic, but it's based on the best available science at the time. In 5 years' time, everything might change. But you know, all we can do is what we got now. there's a newer procedure, scientific criteria for a general decision-making framework, which I'm not going to tell. I'm trying to get if you like, my head around this new framework we're having to use now. We identify the chemical, we collect the data, identification of relevant hazard, then we decide which pathway does it seem to go down. Is it more like chemical agents reactive, chemical agents directive, or is it more like a carcinogen mutagen? And then we carry on the same way. In the last 0 seconds, I've got 2 slides, if I may, just for some considerations for the setting of occupational exposure and its particulates. Some of the points have been picked up this morning, and I was hoping I would have answers by now to these things, rather than a reiteration of the same question. As we all know, some of us go back a long way, and some of us realize where we call these particulates nuisance dusts, and we had this generic limit, which some countries still have, of 10 and 5 or 10 and 4, depending on the sampling head, for inhalable respirable. As we know, there are a range of effects you can get from these so-called non-toxic dust, depending on the amount of exposure. Some irritation, inflammatory changes in various bits of the respiratory tract. For some of the dust, if you breathe them over a long period of time, you can get lung function changes, like forced expiratory volume changes at the epi level you can see. Then you've got to find a way of dealing with data-rich chemicals, such as carbon black and titanium dioxide, where we have good epidemiology, a lot of toxicology, a lot of mechanistic stuff. But on the other hand, we have to deal with a lot of, if I might broaden the argument, into a lot of other particulate material, which are fairly data poor and only have some limited data. So we need to deal with all of that for standard setting. The question I asked, do we need different toxicological considerations for these PLTs in the nano range? Is there some special kind of toxicology that's reserved for nano-structured materials compared to, well, I think I'm going to call them fine materials, but just respiratory ones outside? A lot of the answer seems to say probably not. You just have to use the right metric and understand what you're doing. The toxicology applies to them all. You just have to make sure you understand what you're doing and where it's going to go. And as I said, we've had the discussion about using surface area rather than mass or particulate volume. And the last question is, and we've heard that discussion before, and we'll get back to that, I think. There was a lot of confusion. I said some, but I was being polite. There's a lot of confusion between hazard and risk, which complicates the choice of what is your lead effect. If you're looking at some inflammation or some perturbation of a defensive cell in the body compared to a lung tumor, then your lead effect is quite different. So you've got to make sure you've chosen the right lead effect, and it's relevant for humans. My concern, and I think David White mentioned it before, is looking at good concordance. I'm fundamentally, and I hope many of us are, quite simple biologists. We stand back and, does it make sense in a biological sense of the word? But there doesn't appear to be a totally good concordance, if you look at the adverse outcome pathway, between the commonly used rat model and other rodent species, mouse, hamsters, and also non-human simians and humans, for all of the effects we see in the respiratory tract. And that particularly applies to the most important one, lung tumors. And we've come on that. And that's causing a real problem for people such as Helmut and myself that have to get involved on a regular basis in trying to set standards for occupational exposure limits for these particulate materials. My logic is to use, for good OEL practice, is to use all the available reliable data. And I think you said it yourself before. The weight of evidence approach means don't pick the bits and pieces you like and reject those you don't. Use all the relevant data and see which way all the arrows point. And in my particular case, I've always had this penchant or belief in looking at good human data as a good starting point and maybe sometimes a good finishing point. I'm done. I'm sorry I ran over. That's very naughty. But it's still 0.
Yes. Very briefly and a brief response.
Just a practical question. When extrapolating from animal data, good quality data, to humans, do you use physiologically based models? Do you just use allometric scaling, or do you do a body surface area calculation or
It
something?
depends on the effect. If it's a local effect, like irritation, then maybe you don't need anything at all. It's almost a one-to-one. But if it's systemic, if it's a systemic effect and you've got the PPK modeling data, allometric scaling, yes. And we're actually getting more and more involved with allometric scaling, yes. We're learning from the sort of pharmacological people a lot more how to use that as we get better data. But don't forget, industrial chemicals are actually quite data poor compared to some of our colleagues in the pharma world. And for that, we look over the fence at the luxury. They're swimming in data that we never see.
Okay, let's squeeze in one very, very last intervention in this session before the coffee break. Yes, Maria Donna, we'll hear you tomorrow, I think, at a bit of a foretaste.
Yes, I'm Maria Donna from DuPont. I'm the GeneTox person. I'm also heading our AEL committee. So I would be interested in knowing if you could elaborate a little bit on this weak genotoxic carcinogen. If it's a direct acting mutagen, what qualifiers do you use for determining if it's weak or medium or strong?
Good Lord, is that the time? Yeah, I mean, there are weak genotoxin things. There are things that cause, if you like, very weak aneuploidy or isotopopros. Other ones that damage DNA, but only at a very minor level, where there might be other inflammatory effects as well. So it's a case by case. It's a judgment. There are no ground rules for it. We simply look at it and try to make the arguments for it. But sometimes, don't forget, most things can cause some kind of genetic damage if you get the dose right in an in vitro study. Especially when you don't have the in vivo data in vitro. So it's quite difficult.